Hey there! This project started off as an experiment in miniature terrain and ended up being one of the sculptures I'm most proud of. Like most of my projects, I had an idea. I wanted to build a ruined archway that sort of represents a portal to another dimension. First, I drew it out on a piece of paper, then I transferred the drawing onto some cereal box cardboard, and I made some adjustments to it. I wanted the archway to seem a bit more grand in its appearance. The bulk of this project is going to be sculpted out of Tiya Premium, which is a cement-based sculpting medium. Now, I don't intend for this video to be a tutorial or an instructional on how to work with Tiya, so I'll add some links in the description so you can check out their channel. But in order to make sure the clay sticks to my cardboard, I'm first covering it with hot glue and tinfoil, and I've also made some vertical uprights so that way I can put this entire thing on a cardboard base, and that way I can work on it while it's standing up. And this cardboard base is completely temporary, we'll be ripping it off later. Now that I've got the archway set up the way that I like it, we can now move on to working with Tiya. As I mentioned before, this is a concrete sort of base sculpting medium, and that's why I'm wearing gloves right now, because this cures alkaline, it actually draws moisture away from my skin. It's a material that I've worked with before in the past, but never really something at miniature terrain scale. This project for me was to see if it could actually be done, and if so, if there were any benefits to using Tiya as opposed to, say, foam or other materials that are used in the hobby. Right now, I'm putting a thin layer of material all over the entire armature, and then I'm going to be scratching it with a fork in order to give it a really good texture, so that way I can come back the next day and add a second coat of clay onto it. By working on it in stages, you give it time to strengthen. When I add my second coat of material on, I'm only going to do 1/2 of the archway and add in the brick texture. Once I've gotten that done, I let it sit overnight once again. Going through and adding the brick texture layer by layer was incredibly therapeutic. This was actually probably my favorite part of the entire sculpture. Once the second side of the sculpture was complete, I then took the very last of my Tiya to create a very rough base for the sculpture to sit on. And once I was sure that it would be seated in the material that I had for the base, I could then take my time to stitch the two together, making sure it was a very strong connection. And using a ball of tinfoil, I gave it a sort of rough looking ground texture, but I'm going to end up changing this later on. Now, it's recommended that you let your sculpture cure for 28 days in the presence of moisture in order to make sure that it reaches its full strength. Since this one won't be going outside, I only let it cure for 5 days before moving on to the next part. Once my sculpture was nice and strong, I took my heat gun on the highest setting and burned off any of the exposed fibers. These fibers are part of what give Tiya its strength. When it comes to painting, I always make excuses for how I'm just not very good at it. And so with this project, I actually experimented a couple of times. Because Tiya is so strong, I could very easily go back and remove paint each time that I made a mistake or wasn't very happy with it. Until I seal the final sculpture, it's really simple to make changes wherever I need to. Once I knew exactly what it was that I didn't like in terms of painting, I then went through and did a black wash over the entire archway. As an experiment, I put some PVA glue down onto the base and covered a few sections with some sand. I had never tried this before with Tiya, and I was just curious to see if it would actually stick. I was very pleased to find out that it was an incredibly strong bond, and so I covered the entire base with more glue and sand, as well as the top of my ruined archway. Now that the base had its final texture, I also covered it with some black paint, getting everything to a nice base color so I could begin painting in earnest. For the stones, I went through and picked a couple of different ones for some highlight colors. These are largely a mix between an antique white, a tan, and a dark brown. And there was no real method to this, it was just sort of picking a stone here, a stone there, mixing in a bit more white, a bit more brown, and then going back and making changes as I needed to. I knew more than anything, I just didn't want all the bricks to be the same gray color. I wanted there to be a little bit of underlying variation. Once my individual bricks were highlighted, I did a dry brush over the entire piece to lighten it up. To darken it back down again, I did a final black wash over the entire archway, and I decided that the base needed to have a much darker color to move forward. Something new I've never tried before is actually using flock on a little sculpture like this. I have some stones that I found outside, grass flock that was gifted to me from a friend, as well as these strange grassy looking vines. At least I think they're intended to be vines. I can actually pull them apart and use them as weeds. To secure the stones in the grass, I placed PVA everywhere I wanted it to be, and just proceeded to place and sprinkle it on top. To attach the weeds, I actually used super glue for this just to make sure that it was going to be a really strong connection. And finally, to finish off the base, I painted a walkway underneath the arch. I don't know exactly where this stopped being a fun experiment and became one of my favorite sculptures, but I am very pleased with the result. I was so pleased, in fact, that this sculpture is actually now at its new temporary home in one of my favorite cafes, waiting for someone to give it a forever home. I'm really pleased with how the paint turned out, and I look forward to experimenting more with flock and sand and other things to build up terrain in the future. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to hit the like button, share it with a friend, and be sure to subscribe, as I'm going to keep making more of these in the future. Let me know if you have any specific questions about the process of sculpting, because I'd be happy to answer those. Until the next one, cheers!